that they will not be too diplomatic, that we might get some forthright comments as well as polite diplomacy. I'm well aware that this is an area that is fraught with historic and indeed contemporary tensions that spill over very strongly when it comes to energy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I suspect that the East Med will be a focus of some of their remarks. So without any further ado, can I introduce the British Ambassador, Matthew Lodge. Get it right.
Shall I go?
You just go up that, that's fine.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you to Kostis and the team for inviting me to join this afternoon's panel. It's a great pleasure, not least to be back here in Thessaloniki. I will get straight to the point, I think, from a British perspective, if I may, because as John alluded, and as we've already heard from a number of those who have presented in that first session, there are some fundamental challenges that face us, not just in Europe, not just in this part of Europe, but globally. And it is something that has been commented about extensively, particularly since Putin's invasion of Ukraine some 15, 16 months ago now. But even before, and I remember this very clearly as a British ambassador arriving in Athens some 21 months ago, just as we were preparing for the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow. And of course, the world is facing an energy crisis. It has been undoubtedly aggravated by the invasion of Ukraine and has also peaked as a result of increased demand from economies as they reopened after the pandemic. And in such an unstable political environment, access to uninterrupted, reliable and affordable energy that contributes to economic growth and sustains people's lives and activities has become more important than ever. But as we tried to do in the United Kingdom when the world gathered in Glasgow, and as our Egyptian friends picked up the mantle last autumn, and as the Emiratis will do so this autumn, at the same time, energy security must go hand in hand with climate action. It cannot be a case of either or, it must be a case of both. And if we simply respond to the ongoing crisis by deepening our dependence on fossil fuels, that would be a grave mistake. We need to pursue investments in clean energy, including renewables, electrification, and a range of clean fuels as the only way forward. And again, to draw out from the challenges that this region historically has faced and continues to face, these global challenges, this global twin-track challenge of energy security and tackling the climate change risk to the planet, requires global solutions and global cooperation, or at least as global as we can make it. And it needs to be based on collective action, based on agreed rules. Achieving meaningful energy security as well as net zero is no exception to that. And this is where, as a diplomat and not an energy expert, I would argue that diplomacy as a foreign policy tool plays a crucial part. Now, Southeast Europe and the broader East Med region is, of course, of particular interest and geopolitical importance as it can enhance the energy security across all of the European continent and for Western democracies more broadly. Major gas discoveries in the past decade showcase the region's true potential, but it's about much more than gas, of course. And the aspirations of Greece's Balkan neighbours in a European trajectory plays another part in a complex and sometimes difficult puzzle. But that regional cooperation and dialogue that we talk about has to actually mean something and it needs to be key. It's very striking, as so many of us, whether as NATO allies, whether as European Union member states, or whether just as Western liberal democracies, are working consistently to try and reduce our dependence on Russia's oil and gas for various reasons, at the same time as a Balkan nation has just signed a 3-year natural gas supply deal with Russia. So there are challenges clearly ahead. Greece has a particular role to play, I would argue, not only as a pillar of stability, but also as a driving force behind the diversification of energy sources and the establishment of alternative supply routes, ultimately playing a potentially very important role in the region's energy autonomy and security. So the government, previous governments, let's see where we end up after the 25th of June, but the government's commitment and long-term aspirations to become an energy hub and offering an alternative solution for the wider region is something that even on the other side of Europe we support wholeheartedly. You know better than I do, perhaps, about the range of investments and capacity that is being brought to the Eastern Mediterranean, and particularly to Greece, whether it's investments in LNG terminals, we heard a bit about it before, whether it's the Revithoussa LNG facility, as well as new FSR units in Alexandroupoli and other facilities elsewhere near Thessaloniki and near Volos. These highlight in a concrete and practical way the role that Greece can play as a gateway in the region. And the fact, of course, that regasified LNG will be transported back to Bulgaria and Serbia is encouraging in itself for that regional dynamic and opens up wider future prospects for Greece's role in the region. So in this ever-changing political environment, and I'll come on in a moment to some of the specifics of the UK perspective on this, the British government, tied like everybody else is to the challenge of energy security, committed as we all are to the net zero challenge and tackling the climate emergency, has set out a number of strategic priorities. The first one, and I say this because I am a diplomat and I am an advocate for international cooperation and partnership, has to be about building and nurturing strategic partnerships amongst those committed to upholding shared democratic values and responsibilities. The second one has to be, as we are doing and we have heard, about pivoting towards clean, affordable energy. Thirdly, necessitated by the invasion of Ukraine, accelerated by that invasion, but in any case, as good common political and economic sense, reducing over-reliance on any single supplier, and in this case, reducing global reliance on Russian fossil fuels. 4, building international support to reduce Russian energy revenues through internationally and regionally coordinated action. That may sound like a more political than a purely energy point, but of course these things are all interrelated. And then last but very much not least, scaling up low carbon solutions such as renewables by building on and leading in areas of UK comparative advantage. And we heard from Mr. Papastamatou just now from the wind community about Greece's comparative advantage in this part of Europe. Of course, for those of you who know the United Kingdom and the winds that blow there, you'll know why wind has become such an important component for us. But not just wind, onshore and offshore, also grids, hydrogen and carbon capture. So, ladies and gentlemen, the UK is determined to play a leading role in efforts to tackle climate change, and we have made significant changes in decarbonising our own economy. If you look at the latest UK power generation statistics for the last quarter of last year, wind reached a record high of some 24.6% share of generated power. Fossil fuel generation came down, it's still at just over 40%, and gas remains a principal part of the UK generation mix, 38.4%. But we have already had periods of time where all of the UK's energy supply has been provided for a day or two by renewable sources. So the trajectory, the direction of travel is clear. The UK is advocating and will continue to advocate for collaboration with international and regional partners, supporting the adoption of energy-related clean technologies and services. And we believe that we can and must work in partnership on those areas of relative expertise and particular advantage, whether it's renewables, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's electromobility, or indeed green buildings, which are amongst our priorities. And let me just finish by saying, if all of that seems a lot about the North Sea and about the challenge we have on the other side of Europe, of course, we operate still in an interconnected global economy and an increasingly connected European energy network. So I'm pleased that BP has a 20% share in the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. Delighted that we've got British company Lightsource BP actively developing a portfolio of utility-scale solar projects in Greece, totaling more than 1 gigawatt. Next Energy Capital has acquired 9 utility-scale solar PV projects, totaling 132 megawatts, and a majority in 6 standalone battery storage projects, totaling some 400 megawatts. And Hive Energy already proved their credentials in places as far-flung as Latin America and South Africa, considered one of the top 5 renewable players in the Greek solar market, with 287 megawatts of solar projects having already secured connection terms. And they also launched a solar hydrogen project with batteries, which was awarded the status of the first flagship investment of exceptional importance in the country. And last but not least, SSE Renewables are investing in wind and other renewable projects here. So that's just a snapshot, and I'll wrap up because I know John wants us to be succinct, but just to say the need to challenge these, to tackle these two challenges in parallel, the need to do it collaboratively and collectively, and the need to draw on the relative expertise that we are all able to bring is, it seems to me, self-evidently the way we must proceed. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you very much for being short. I'm not going to take questions now because we will have time after all of the speakers to have questions, and I think they may want to comment on each other's comments and remarks as well. So without any further ado, Eric, would you like to come and have a
Sure,
word
I'll just deliver from the stage.
From the American
Possible?
Embassy?
Sure. I appreciate the invitation to speak here today briefly. I'm really going to, again, try to be succinct and focus on the U.S. interest in what we're doing in the Eastern Mediterranean and where we see our engagement and support can be of help. Because I think a lot of the speakers have laid out very well and better than I can this kind of challenges that Southeast Europe and Europe faces as far as energy security and supply. Simply put, East Med is of strategic importance to the United States. This comes as no surprise. It's of even more importance now because of Russia's reinvasion and occupation of Ukraine. But the United States has been looking to deleverage Gazprom in Europe for quite some time and try to limit Russia's ability to influence political outcomes by virtue of cheap hydrocarbons. It's been mentioned that TANF and TAP was a first effort to try to break Russia's essential monopoly of supply to Europe. There's more urgency now, obviously. Where we see the United States can play a role is our support for Greece as an energy hub is absolutely no secret. We are looking to invest and partner with Greece on their efforts to supply, whether it be natural gas, LNG through Alexandroupoli or Revithousa, the ICB, which was recently completed, or electricity. it's also good for the United States commercial interests too. Greece's transition as an energy hub. United States LNG is booming. The only limitation really right now is our export capacity. We haven't caught up. Our machinery and infrastructure in the United States hasn't caught up to what we can produce and what the world demand is. But we see U.S. LNG exports. I think we're about 50% of Greece's imports last year, and it keeps growing. So this is a success story not only for our strategic desire to lessen Russia's hold on energy markets in Europe, but also for American jobs, frankly put. The broader point is it doesn't really matter if that gas is coming from the U.S. If it gets a bunch of new gas it's going to come online likely in the next 5 to 7 years in the East Med. If it's Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan, it is in our best interest to make sure Greece is playing a role in providing alternative sources of hydrocarbons to Southeast and Central Europe. The other, no surprise, is our climate goals. We see the East Med as being a place where there is a lot of really interesting and potentially exciting opportunities to not only provide Europe with more energy security, but also green energy. So my government's watching really closely the progress and discussions around the various interconnectors. There are 2 sort of major ones right now, the GREGI, which would be a direct interconnector from Egypt to the mainland of Greece. There's another one, the GAP, which would take a little bit of a different route. These are kind of elegant looking solutions on the map, which is why a lot of policymakers in DC kind of look at this and say, "Wow, this is an interesting proposal, and we should support it to the extent we can." We're not picking projects; the market will decide that. Still, there's a lot of hurdles, both technical, commercial, whether it's bankable, and also political, because that electricity, if it is imported to Greece, has to go somewhere. Greece cannot absorb it all. So again, the logical solution would be exporting electricity to its neighbors, whether it's Bulgaria, whether it's Italy. That seems a lot easier because they are in the EU. But actually, strategically for the United States as well, and consistent with our climate change goals, is for Greece to provide cheap, clean, renewable energy to the Balkans, which are reliant on lignite and other sources of energy we'd rather they not use. So what can we do? Well, we really try to look for U.S. companies that either have the technology or the capital to invest in some of these projects. We can have some moral suasion. We can say, hey, look, we can bring people together, but ultimately these are commercial deals. We really would like American investment, and there have been some discussions along those lines. The Development Finance Corporation, this is it's sort of similar to the EBRD for those of you who aren't familiar with it. They also have a lot of potential capital to invest in some of these strategic projects to help make them more bankable. Their due diligence process tends to be a little longer. They are under some constraints, congressional and otherwise, which makes that option not as nimble and sometimes as we'd like. But we have facilitated contact with them for the promoters of all these projects, essentially. And so they're in discussions to see whether DFC can fit in. Because one of the things that we hear criticism of, and it's not unfair, is when we're talking about China or we're talking about Russia, they don't invest on market principles. And we, as the West, need to find tools to help ensure some of this critical infrastructure is in transparent, market-based hands. And so the DFC is one of our answers to try to be able to kind of bridge this gap between what is commercially viable and then what the United States can provide as a government to help make these projects bankable. Another thing we can provide is some expertise. We have some technical experts working with Greece and Albania and North Macedonia and some others on looking how to strengthen their grids and their interconnectivity. As more renewables come online, we're going to need more, because of the intermittency, we're going to need more redundancy. And again, it would be, I think, a good thing for all countries, and it was mentioned by Panayotis, if wind is active at night and you can supply Albania or some neighbors with energy, electricity at night, and then reverse that during the day, that benefits all the countries. Of course, there's a lot of technical and political and regulatory issues with that. And then finally, the United States in the previous administration, but carried through to this one, is also looking for certain political formats to help foster cooperation where the United States could be of help. And one of those is the 3+1, which involves Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. And it covers a broad range of issues, but one of the ones that we're focused on in the embassy and the State Department is energy cooperation. It has climate implications. And it's also an area where our four countries can work together on both technical and regional electricity integration. So I'll end it there. Those are the major major points of focus for us right now in the Southeast Europe and in East Med energy arena.
Eric, thank you very much, and thank you particularly for focusing on the question of how of support for commercial companies in what can be sometimes quite complicated political arenas. It's much needed. And now, Mr. Michael Christidis, former ambassador, wide experience in the region, and if I could just make one point, last job as Secretary General of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, which for some strange reason some years ago hired me to write one or two of their studies. So,
thank you,
over to Mr. Christidis.
Thank you. Well, let me also thank Mr. Stambolis for inviting me to participate in this very important event and be among the distinguished co-panelists. It's a great pleasure. I'm not an expert, I'm not an energy expert, so don't expect anything original or earth-shattering from me. Still, some few thoughts which I would like to share with you. As we heard, the overall situation in the energy market was complex and difficult even before the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. And given also the commitments which were assumed by all states in order to meet their commitments and address the dire consequences of climate change. The situation has become even more unpredictable, of course, and difficult to decipher after the invasion, with the efforts of many states to diversify their energy sources and stop their dependence on Russian oil, gas, etc. And of course, the situation for the average European citizen, with the abrupt and steep rise of energy prices during the first period of this crisis, is too recent to be forgotten, especially, as I said, during its first period. Of course, after the EU pulled itself together and addressed the situation in a much more coordinated and comprehensive way, things turned out eventually much better, thanks also to the milder winter that we heard also from other speakers, and to the more than welcome state interventions in many states. Greece is one such example. In fact, some believe that as a reflection of the grave concern on what might occur if gas flows to Europe dwindled, some or many of the costly extra measures implemented, like for instance storage of extra gas amounts, might prove to be unnecessary and redundant. And it's very interesting that we already read about fears that perhaps some or many of the energy infrastructure projects, especially in what concerns management and storage of LNG, might prove to be useless in a very short time. Because as we all know, after 2030, European states are expected to have introduced so many more alternative energy sources that today's investments in gas and oil projects will perhaps degenerate into useless relics of a past we will all wish to forget. And this last observation brings me to the angle from which I wish to share with you some of my thoughts on how to better address energy security, alternative energy sources, and climate change. And this is the angle of regional cooperation and coordination. We already heard about how important global cooperation and coordination are. I insist on regional cooperation because, as you heard, I have served for 6 years as the Secretary General of a regional organization headquartered in Istanbul, who was exactly promoting the economic cooperation among its member states, energy being, of course, a very, very important sector of similar cooperation. So I have been impregnated with this axiom of regional cooperation. But not only that, I believe it's really foolish today for states to engage unilaterally and without coordination with their neighbors in projects that will inherently have a very restricted lifespan. So the above concerns mostly Southeast Europe, of course, because this is the region where infrastructure projects are still to be realized while others are under construction. It is in Southeast Europe where we have to approach energy supply and energy security in a comprehensive, rational manner which will serve the wider region in an inclusive, consistent, and efficient way. There was ample analysis, and there is also ample reporting on all the existing projects, the ones under construction and others which are being planned or considered. IENE is providing enough documentation and insight on all these projects. What I wish to underline is that although the organization which I mentioned, the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, has never touched upon the political sensitive subjects of cooperation in oil, gas, or pipelines and the relevant infrastructure project, it had achieved a lot in what concerns cooperation in the wider sector of alternative energy sources, of energy efficiency, of green energy investments, and climate change. And in that sense, it has established the so-called BSEC Green Energy Network already in 2014, which is being coordinated by the Energy Policy and Development Center of the National and Kapodistrian University in Athens, under the supervision of the International Secretariat of the organization. Its main mandate was to facilitate the exchange of information and share experience and know-how among national administrative bodies and other relevant entities promoting renewable energy sources and energy efficiency measures and policies. I will not bother you with the detailed achievements and projects which were concluded through and by the BSEC Green Energy Network. I believe this information is readily available to you through the internet. But perhaps the biggest achievement of all in this, let me say, regional cooperation promoted by BSEC is the fact that the continuous contact of administrative and private sector representatives of the member states has greatly facilitated the establishment of a culture of cooperation among them, thus leading to the implementation of concrete joint projects. So I believe that this culture of cooperation should come in handy also in the politically sensitive sector of energy security, dealing with gas, oil, pipelines, and all the rest. I'm happy to note that representatives from almost all countries in Southeast Europe will take the floor at this important event. Thus, we will all have the opportunity not only to be informed on what actually moves in the energy sector locally, but also to delve in important networking among participants. Let me spend also 2 words on what concerns international cooperation in the energy sector in Greece. As, allow me to say, and having served almost 22 years in Southeast Europe and Turkey, I feel a bit responsible in the establishment of the initial phase of cooperation between many of these states, especially between Greece, Bulgaria, and Greece and Turkey. Today, Greece has established or is constructing various connectivity projects with all its immediate neighbors, foremost with Turkey and Bulgaria, as I mentioned. The feasibility of new oil pipelines is even being examined. We hear about the prospect of a pipeline connecting Alexandroupolis to Burgas. Old pipelines like the one connecting Thessaloniki to Skopje in North Macedonia are being upgraded. New gas pipelines are being planned, East Med, Poseidon, and new storage facilities are under construction or consideration. We all heard about them. Most, if not all, of the above have as their main objective to serve and satisfy not only Greek internal needs, but also the needs of neighboring countries and perhaps others further north. Greece has to pursue its relevant efforts in a way that considers and includes also the aims and interests of its neighbors, if we wish to see these efforts crowned with success. What is sure is that new challenges and opportunities come up almost daily, and we should be ready and eager to address the first and seize the latter. For example, let me just name the Greek-Bulgarian agreement concerning the almost forgotten, as I said, oil pipeline Burgas-Alexandroupolis, now reversed to Alexandroupolis-Burgas. It makes sense because it will bring oil much faster to the refinery in Burgas than if it is transported through the already congested straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. And if rumors, I recently heard that the Russian Lukoil refinery in Burgas could be up for sale in the near future, then the Alexandroupolis-Burgas pipeline makes even more sense, especially if some Greek entity would decide to invest in this above probable sale of the refinery. And of course, another new element is, for the broader region, could be the extraction by Turkey of the new gas deposit off its Black Sea coast. I recently heard during the last Delphi Economic Forum by the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, who said that this new development could further enhance Greco-Turkish cooperation in the field of energy. So, in conclusion, let me say that Greece already covers the greatest part of its energy needs from alternative sources of energy, and is perhaps among the European frontrunners in this respect. We have all the necessary prerequisites to continue in this way and become really the regional example to be followed. I wish every success in our 2 days deliberations, because the Southeast Europe Energy Dialogue is today more important and useful than ever in our hopefully joint efforts to fulfill our common aims and objectives. Thank you very much for your attention.
What I find absolutely refreshing is the way in which you have practical cooperation on energy projects over a plethora of countries that have, in the past, not always cooperated, but who now understand the benefits. But I remain puzzled by one dilemma, which is, we know there is a very substantial resource base in the East Med that is under practical development at the moment. But it remains isolated in terms of delivery to a market that would love to receive it, namely Southeast Europe. Is it likely to come online into Europe before we see an effective renewables revolution, essentially negating the requirement for East European gas in Southeast Europe, for East Med gas in Southeast Europe markets? I'm curious to know which of you you want to try. Okay, Eric.
My career is not going anywhere. This is why I'm a diplomat and not a capital allocator.
Right.
I don't know. And that's one of the things that we try to, at least for the U.S. Embassy, we try to be mindful of the fact that we can think it's a good idea politically. It can help our strategic needs. But at the end of the day, it's somebody's going to build it and somebody's going to buy the product. And we don't have that much control over that. I can tell you from our discussions with some of the developers, the East Med gas and oil, they view it as viable. It's now a question of what's the best and most economic route to get it from where it is, which is isolated, to markets that want it. And there's a number of options that they're looking at. There's an option of, as far as I'm aware, they could use Egypt as the place to gasify it and then ship it out as LNG. There's possibilities in Cyprus. There's a number of options there. But again, I'm not a capital allocator. I'm a guy who writes reports and sends emails. So.
Well, let me just say that I'm not an expert also, I'm a diplomat, and what I know on these issues is what I'm reading and hearing from the experts themselves. Yet I believe that there were some recent developments which have brought the possibility of implementing East Med again on the surface. I'm thinking about the latest agreement between Cyprus and Israel, for instance, which could make it, this agreement about having Israeli LNG being transported to Cyprus and from there possibly through Crete to Greece and to Italy. There are many interested parties, and I would say even partners of this project, that believe it is feasible, and given the fact that especially gas has been named as a transitional source of energy for some years to come, it would be also, let's say, economically competitive and viable. But as I said, I'm not an expert. I cannot put my hand on the fire, as we say in Greek.
John, well, let me just dip my toes in this potentially controversial topic, but turn it round a bit and say, I think what we've heard from the experts, what we've heard from us as diplomats here is about the importance of diverse energy sources, varied supplies, the essential requirements, both in terms of delivering those sustainable supplies, but also tackling the climate challenge of cooperation and collaboration across regions. In our case here, we're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean. I think what is clear is that as long as political and geostrategic impediments remain in place that block regional cooperation, then not only Southeast Europe, but also the rest of Europe and the West will be at a disadvantage, because we will not be able to make the most effective, efficient and timely use of the resources that are already identified. And we will not be able to do so in a way that is efficient and avoids the spectre that Michael suggests of heavy investment leading to white elephants. So I think, and I'd also step back, if I may, as a British ambassador, British diplomat here in Greece, and say if there's one thing that I've noticed very prominently in the 20 years since I was last here, it is how the horizons for foreign policy, security and energy discussions have changed and extended.
Dramatically.
And you look at Greece's relationship, not just with Cyprus, a long-time partner, but Greece's relationship with Israel, with Egypt, with countries in the Gulf, etc. Now, that must tell us something, because that hasn't happened just because people woke up one morning and said, oh, we want to go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Cairo and make friends. There are drivers behind this, but conscious that we have Turkish experts in the room and so on, the Eastern Med challenge, it seems to me, is whether actually the energy requirements and the climate emergency that faces us can transcend political challenges in a way that collective solutions can be found.
Now, it's most unfair of me to say this, but we do actually have another ambassador in the room, or at least another recent ambassador. Mr. Gulden, would you like to make a comment, or would you like to take some time before making a comment on the East Med? Just go to the microphone, that'll be fine.
It's a rather complex issue, but this can be only solved for benefits of the whole region if a holistic approach that have all countries playing a role in this regard, including the Northern Cyprus, plays a role. This is what I think. Naturally, economics play a much more important role than the political drivers. But on the other side, I think this is a serious issue. If this needs to be a just solution there, equitable and just solution, everybody has to think about it, how we can achieve it.
Thank you. Now, we've got time for questions from the floor. Christos, can you go to the mic behind you?
John, sorry, okay. We have seen some time ago that the United States of America implemented the Inflation Reduction Act for aiming to attract foreign countries to be established in the country, or American companies to stay in America. On the other hand, we had the European Community as retaliation to implement another act, the Net Zero Industry Act, for the same reasons. So, do you consider that this is a basis for a possible energy fight between the two allies?
Which of you would like to take it on? Eric.
I'll be honest, I am aware that there are some challenges to be worked out with the with various trade policies, the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's some technical barriers. I think, to be honest, we haven't heard much about it in Greece, so it hasn't affected either U.S. companies in Greece or Greek companies in America or people looking to export. This is very much a Brussels-based discussion. I do know, I can say two things. Anytime you have new legislation in the United States, our Congress is independent and they don't necessarily always vet some of their bills with whether it's diplomatic experts or trade experts to say this might be problematic. There is a commitment by the Biden administration. Europe, there's no secret, President Biden is a strong proponent of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. He is a strong proponent of strengthening ties with traditional European allies through the EU or individually. And there is a commitment to try to work out these differences on an equitable basis. So I know those discussions are ongoing. I know there are some things, some issues to resolve, but my understanding is, despite what you hear, what you read in the papers, and some frustration by the Europeans, perhaps, that there is a dialogue, and I think the expectation is these things will be worked out and harmonized.
Any further questions from the floor? No. I think there is one question that comes to mind, which is, we have a phenomenal opportunity for renewables in this region. But we also have, as has been pointed out, a great reluctance to get out of some of the fossil fuels, notably solid fuels. Which way do you think it's going to go? Would you like to?
Let me say that the way we go is entirely in the hands of the big companies, multinationals, which are active in fossil fuel energy, and they are the ones who will be spending the greatest amounts on the change. So perhaps we are in their hands, although I believe we shouldn't. I believe that states should be, let me say, directing this effort in order to speed up the whole procedure, if of course we are technically ready to do so, because today we heard that even if we proceed with more alternatives, we will be unable to use the energy from the alternatives if we don't have the right grids, we don't establish the right grids. So it's a combination of all. And as I said, it's in the hands of governments, of states, and of the great multinational players in the broader energy field.
Absolutely.
Can I chip in, John? I think, if I may, I think there are 3 points I'd like to make, slightly to take a different track from Ambassador Christidis. But first off, I would say we all know, as consumers, as business people, as academics, as diplomats, as policymakers, as energy experts, that there is an individual responsibility that we all have as citizens and consumers. So whilst I don't disagree that the heavy lifting, the big innovation has to be done by those organizations, whether they're commercial entities or government bodies or whatever, that have the resource, I think it is important that we do not let ourselves off the hook individually and we remember our individual responsibility. Secondly, I think we need to be having more robust discussions. And I'm sat here in Thessaloniki and not in Piraeus, but I'm very struck coming back to Greece and talking to the shipping community about decarbonisation. And all those who don't have assets in the shipping world say, well, come on, you need to get on and decarbonise. And the shipping community, not unreasonably, turned around and says, well, if you show us a viable technology that we can implement, because it costs us millions to invest in a new fleet, then we'll do it. So which comes first? And the reality is that the two have to come together. And I think the last point I would make is, and this is where the United States, given the scale of its economy, but also the nature of the way the United States economy has worked for decades now, I think can teach us all a lesson. And that is the importance of investing in research and innovation. And that's why, forgive the British party political broadcast, but it's why we're very keen to explore the scope of, and we wanted to remain a United Kingdom that decided to leave the European Union, decided to leave the Erasmus Plus program, wanted to remain part of Horizon Europe, because we recognize the value of and the necessity of collaborative research and innovation investment, and that has to be done at scale. So I think we need to remember our individual responsibilities. We need to recognize that we can't just be for one sector of the economy or another, or for private sector or government. It has to be collective, and we need to be investing in the research.
Maybe I can just make one quick point.
Yep, of course.
I fully agree with my colleagues. Prior to my tenure in Greece, I was in Mexico. And as far as renewables and investment in renewables, and I think it speaks to the point as to where we're going, the problems that our companies had, we're not raising capital, we're not finding buyers, we're not having trouble making profits. The problems were more technical, whether it's permits. Greece, it can be a little difficult to get permits. Mexico is even worse at times. And just technical questions as to how you integrate and build the infrastructure, which is where the government has a role. Build the infrastructure and devote resources to upgrading the grid so more renewables can come online. I haven't really heard much of an issue where people think renewables aren't viable or they're not a growth industry, quite the opposite. So I think the trend's going to continue, and it's up to policymakers to create the conditions where more renewables can come online, because there is a global consensus, or mostly a global consensus, that renewables and clean energy is the way of the future.
I think if I can add my own line on this, it is that the transition in some ways is happening much, much faster than we thought. That was one of the points about the way in which last year we saw that investment in renewables was higher than investment in oil or gas. And this year we're seeing that for every dollar invested in oil, gas or coal, $1.7 is getting invested in renewables. And the other point is, renewables investments can very often start yielding outcomes within 2 years. Yep. So that means we are going to see the results of this investment very quickly indeed. And with that comes the application of technology. I have no idea when, for instance, large-scale battery storage will become commercially viable. But we're already starting to see it becoming viable in an energy security sense. The Australians are trying it. That's a first stage. And if you want a comparable example, look at the development of the tar sands in Canada, known to be in existence for decades. Always, always you'd hear the cry, if only the price of oil was $1 higher, it'd be commercially viable. In 1994, when oil prices were going down, they became commercially viable. Suddenly you saw the massive investment. And I suspect this kind of thing will happen with battery storage. I don't know whether it'll be next year or 5 years or 10 years. I'm not an expert on that. But I do think that these things will happen very quickly. and unexpectedly. And when they do, they take off in exactly the same way that something simple, like an LED light fitting, which was once a luxury good, now is almost, in electrical terms, the equivalent of peanuts. So, have we got any more questions or any more comments? No? Then in that case, can I thank our panelists very much, Matthew Lodge, Eric Holmgren and Michael Christides, and say, I think it's been a great panel, and thank you again.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.